In part one, we talked about how to prepare your bullets, size them and lubricate them to get them ready for 4570 loading. And now in part two, we're going to take those bullets and we're going to take black powder, primers, and cartridge cases, and we're going to load some finished ammunition, some black powder 4570s. Well, our bullets are prepared, so really now we're ready to reload. And as you can see, I've mounted a press on the bench. This is a Lee Century press. It's one of 3 presses that I use on this bench, and it's mounted in the Lee bench plate, so the lubricizer came off. This press goes in. This is a big, robust press. It's very good for large rifle rounds. That's what I typically use it for. I have another press that I use for handgun ammunition, and then I have a turret press I use on this bench for high production, generally auto pistol ammunition. But this baby is a rifle press, and we're going to load this with a set of Lee dies. This is a 3-piece die set from Lee. Pretty standard. I like Lee dies. A lot of people think that because they're inexpensive, maybe the quality's not so good. I use dies from all manufacturers, but most of the dies I have are Lees, and I think they're great for the great value for the money, and a great value overall, no matter what the money was. So here's what's in this set. We have a scoop for powder. That's pretty much worthless, I have to be honest with you there. We have a shell holder right here, and this is what is going to mount onto the press, and we'll show that in just a minute. And then we have 3 different dies for 3 different parts of the reloading operation. This die is the decapping and sizing die. This die opens up the case mouth so that it can accept the bullet. And it also, one of the reasons I like Lee dies is because it is a die that you can actually load powder right through the top on, and we'll show you that, though I have a different technique we're going to use for 4570. And then this die seats the bullet and crimps it. So the first procedure that we're going to do is we are going to decap some shells. We're going to deprime them and size them. So, as you can see, we've got a shell right here, and right in the back here, you can see that there's a spent primer. It's been fired. And what we need to do is get it in this condition, where the primer is out, and we can load a new primer in the shell to set off the powder. Now we also want to size it, and this die right here sizes and it decaps. And if you can see this, there's a pin right there, and that pin, that's what knocks the spent primer out. And the rest of the body of the die is what sizes it back to factory specs. Now, a lot of people who shoot single shot 4570 black powder silhouette type shooting, they don't always resize. And if you're using exactly the same rifle all the time, your shells will fire form when they fire to that chamber. But not all chambers are made the same way. And a shell that's fire formed in one chamber may not fit in the chamber of another gun. And if you're somebody like me, and I've got 4 4570s of various types around to shoot, then you absolutely want to resize your brass. But if you do not want to do that, you can buy separate decapping dies that will not resize. Okay, so here's the deal. We've got the die in place right here. Right, we're going to run a shell up onto that. In order to do that, we have to mount in the shell holder. But on this die, kind of the trick here, this press, the trick here is I'm going to put this in, and this is Lee's Auto Prime. It would allow us to prime on the press. I actually don't like priming on most presses, except for progressives and turret presses, where you pretty much have to get the benefit of the volume. But we need this over there because that piece of steel, you can see how it would go up and would put the primer in. The primer would be in that cup. That piece of steel is going to divert the primer so it falls in here and then goes down into this tube. So we'll just run one up. We go all the way up. You hear dink, and down it goes. And now we have an open primer pocket. All right, so we'll do another one. We just run it right up, and we've got a good shell. And down here, there is a tube, and it fits right on the bottom of the press. And if you can hear that rattling around, those are spent primers. So I'll show you. We're knocking them out of the shells, they go into that tube, and when the tube is full, we just throw it away. Right, now, the trick with these that I did not mention previously, and I should, is that because 4570 shells have a taper to them, so that when they're heated, you know, you're firing, you got a hot chamber, that slight taper means that they can extract easier. They don't stick in the chambers as much. Though certainly Custer's battalion learned that they will stick. Those were the old copper cases they were using. So because it's not parallel-sided, the dies are not carbide. And that means that they need to be lubricated before we can do the sizing operation we just did. And what I use to lubricate them is a spray-on product called One Shot. There's a lot of different things available to lube them, but I just throw them in a box, spray them around the top, roll them around a little bit, spray them again, and we are good to go. And as you can see, they will go right up into the die and come back out again, and if they were not lubricated, we could have quite a bit of trouble getting them out. Okay, so that's the first procedure. Now, the next procedure that we need to do is we need to get a primer in there so we can load powder in and put a bullet in and it's going to fire. And as I said, we could use this device right here. However, and I'll just get us close to that so that we can see exactly what that looks like. All right, let's take a look at that. Okay, you can see this comes down. There's a little cup right here. And that little cup would hold a primer, and it would force, when this comes all the way down, it would force the primer up into that cartridge. But I really don't like doing it that way on these single shot cartridges. So I'm going to show you our other technique for priming. But certainly if you have one of these and you want to prime on the bench, you can do it. You would just load a primer in the back right here, and then when you come down, it's going to place it in. Okay, but there's another device just for priming that I think will work much better for us, and that's what I'm going to show you now. Well, the next step we're going to talk about is priming. And for 4570s with black powder, I prime with Federal large rifle primers. A lot of people like to use the Magnum large rifle primer, and that's fine. What I found is that's not really necessary for loads for modern rifles. If I was loading for an original trapdoor rifle, I would use a whole different procedure, and maybe I'll do a video on that at some point. And I would use Magnum primers for that. However, these are going to be shot in modern reproductions, and the large rifle primers will actually do just fine in that, and certainly that's what I use. Now, instead of priming on the press, there are several excellent handheld devices for priming. This particular one is made by RCBS, and that's what I prefer to use for rifle primers. I have another set made by Lee, and I use those quite often for pistol primers. The way this works is the shell holder that we had mounted on our press mounts right on this, and then there's a reservoir that holds the primers, and they feed them in, and we just pump them through. So let's prime a few shells, and I'll show you exactly how easy it is. Now, you'll also notice that I now have the shells in a loading block, and from this point on in the process, you really should be using a loading block because it's going to keep you from spilling things. It makes it easy for you to inspect your shells rather than just trying to stand them up, and particularly that's the case when they have powder in them. And if you knock them over, you're just starting all over again. So let's prime a few of these. Alright, so we grab a shell, pretty easy. We will slide it right in here, into the shell holder, and then we just squeeze the handle, and that will put a primer in. Because if you can see the action, it's about to come up here, there's a piston that raises up in there, and if we grab a primer, you can see that there's a primer coming up to the top. Okay, so that is going to push it in. And we'll just pop a shell on top of that, and we'll seat that primer as well. And as you can see, we're good. We got a nice clean primer. Now, the reason I like using the RCBS hand primer as opposed to the primer on the press is you've got a reservoir and it's easy to manipulate and everything just goes right in and you can load pretty fast. Let's get one down in there. There we go. Kind of depends on, I'm holding at this angle because it depends on gravity feeding these down into basically into the magazine to prime the next round. So off we go. Alright, so in a nutshell, that's priming. Once they're primed, we're going to have to expand the mouths here so that they can accept a bullet because right now it's sized right down to the size of the finished case. So we need to open that back up a little bit. And then we're going to put powder in, we're going to seat a bullet, and we're going to have a complete set of cartridges made up. So next step is going to be the case mouth expansion. The next step in the process is case mouth expansion. And the reason we're doing that is because we've got our formed cases here, right? But you can clearly see. Now, if I was to try to insert a bullet into that, it doesn't go because the case is just too tight. And I would just end up shaving lead or crushing the case. So what I want to do is I want to run that up into this die right here that has a plug in it that has a kind of a bell shape that will open that up. And after I've done that, once I've run that through, now, as you can see, that bullet is started. Now you only want it to open it up enough to just get that bullet started because we're going to have to close it back down again later on in the seating process to bring it back into spec. Alright, so that's how we open up the case mouth. But I'm going to tell you, one of the reasons why I like Lee dies, for black powder particularly, is because it gives me a lot of options for powder. So Lee dies, unlike a lot of them, allow you to load powder right through the top of the case mouth expansion die. So while I'm expanding the case mouth on that, if I was of a mind to do it, I could take my powder measure, pour powder right in there, and I would be good to go. Now, for these 4570 cartridges, I'm going to show you a different technique for putting the powder in, but there are a lot of black powder cartridges that I would load exactly like this. Most pistol cartridges, anything that doesn't require much compression at all. But for a rifle cartridge like this, it takes a lot of powder. I've got another technique, and that's what we're going to take a look at next.